with the world right now, or at least Denver, Colorado, and surrounding areas. Welcome. I am Keith Garcia, Artistic Director of the C Film Center here in Denver, Colorado, and happy to welcome you virtually to this fantastic lecture on the films of Hong Sangsoo. A few films that we're showcasing on our virtual cinema right now, which hopefully you've gotten a chance to check out over the last few weeks, or will get to check out in the next week or so. We are currently playing brand new restorations of Yourself and Yours, Hill of Freedom, and Woman on the Beach. If you haven't gotten around to those, after you watch this lecture, definitely jump on our virtual cinema at denverfilm.org and watch these fantastic modern masterpieces. But tonight we're here together to now, at least, watch this fantastic lecture. Welcome. I am Keith Voices, and I'll introduce them right now. We have Boram Jeong, who's the assistant professor at the Department of Philosophy for UCD, and Adam Graves, the associate professor of the Department of Philosophy at MSU, and also the director of D-Phi. And Adam, if you'd like to tell everyone all about that and what this evening holds in store, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Keith. Really appreciate it. And I want to thank Keith and everyone else at the Denver Film for hosting this event. I know there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes to put something like this together. So I really appreciate all of your guys' work. And I do encourage everybody who's here tuned in to check out the Denver Film's new platform, where they have, in addition, obviously, to the Hong Sangsoo films, lots of other programming. I think without the C Film Center, Denver wouldn't be the place that it is. It wouldn't be survivable, honestly, for me. So, yeah. So I direct the Denver project for the humanistic inquiry. D-Phi, and we're a public humanities center at MSU Denver that partners with cultural institutions like the C Film Center all across the kind of metro region. And we do events of this sort. We also bring in speakers. Obviously, most of our events are typically live. So in an age of coronavirus, things have been quite different for us. And so we're trying out more, we're trying to do more virtual programming. And one of the things that we're really excited about that we started is a podcast called The Human Context, Timeless Questions in the Present Tense. So if you are the sort of person who listens to podcasts, please check us out. It's on I think it's on pretty much every podcast app out there. So if you have Spotify or Apple Podcast, just type in The Human Context. We interview scholars from around the country, or really around the world, on topics of kind of, timely, of a timely nature, but drawing upon their knowledge of kind of vast knowledge of literature and history and philosophy and whatnot. So anyways, check that out. Our last episode was featuring Cornel West, the prominent African-American philosopher now back at Harvard University. He was kind of toggling back and forth between Princeton and Harvard for a while there. Let's see, I've just been notified by my trusty work study student and kind of coordinator of the program that you should go to dphi.org, which is our webpage. Anyways, sorry, that was a lot longer plug than I intended. Thank you for bearing with me. Anyway, so here's what the night's going to look like, basically. Boram is going to give a kind of a lecture presentation for, I think, about 15 minutes or so, after which I'll share some of my thoughts. I'll be a lot quicker, I'm sure. I have significantly less to say. And then we're going to open it up to Q&A and kind of virtual conversation. Unfortunately, it can't be live cast, but you do have the ability to type in comments and questions. So Keith will then jump back in after I'm done, and he'll be reading your comments and questions. So feel free to, ask a question. We may not have an answer to it, but you should also feel free to make comments as well, because I know a lot of you have seen these films, and I'm sure you have a lot to share about them. So with that, I'll cede the ground over to you, Boram.
All right. Well, thank you for having me, and thanks everyone for participating tonight, spending Thursday evening with us. I thought I would begin by talking about how Hong Sangsoo makes his films, just briefly, in case some of you are not familiar with the filmmaker or his very unique method of filmmaking. So he makes, he's known for being very prolific. So he makes at least one movies a year, sometimes two or three. So he's made 27 films so far. And he's very low budget. He makes his films in about 3 weeks, three to 4 weeks, and with a very small crew members, sometimes like 4, 7, or 15. And they only shoot for 3 or 4 days, or max they meet 7 times over that span of 3 weeks. And he doesn't have a script when they start shooting the film. So he writes his script every morning based on what they shot the day before. So so he writes the day of, like starting 4 or 5 a.m. and then for about 3 to 4 hours he finishes, and then sometimes he calls the actors the morning of also. So depending on their availability, they might be on it or not. So it's very spontaneous process his filmmaking is. This we'll go back to this filmmaking method later, because I think there's a good reason for it, like the way he developed his own method this way. So I would like to show you some diagrams actually. So I'm gonna share screen here to show you some images. All right, so I'm gonna start with this, the top one that I named A Frame of Mind. It's a diagram from the movie Woman on the Beach. The director, Jung-nae's character, makes this diagram to explain what sort of struggle he is in. So this wavy figure he explains as a reality, right? And then these dots are his observations. And there are some points or some images, he calls it, the some images that are more sticky, like they're stickier than others. So these are like frequently circulated images. So in this case, the woman he loves, this woman's previous relationship gave him these impressions, so that he is stuck with this image, like she is this kind of woman, right? Like I'm not giving out too many details, but anyways, so this is sort of the selected features of a situation, or selected features of a person that we get fixated on. But because this triangular figure is more frequently circulated, then more comprehensive image, this like coffin shaped figure, I will call it, this is actually closer to the reality, but he gets fixated on this 3 images that are more sensual, right? Or more familiar to him. So he is trying to fight against this this image, right? Or yeah, like, or tendencies or propensities of the mind, we can call. So I wanted to start with this image because I think this tells us a lot about how Hong Sangsoo views the world. So he sees our life as struggle against this sort of preconceptions or maybe prejudices, tendencies to see the world. So something that like really prevents us from seeing the world as it is. So we cannot really capture this reality, right? Because it is a self-fluid, and the subject who views this reality is also fluid. So this reality is really not something we can approach or capture. I wanted to perhaps talk more generally about Hong Sangsoo's work in two different aspects. The first one is repetition. So based on this diagram, right? So in this case, the triangle is what we repeat, right? The image of things or image of the situation, image of a person. So his movies have a lot of this repetitive movement, as you probably have noticed in these three films that are on virtual cinema right now in the Hong Sangsoo mini retrospective. So there's similarity or self-referentiality, if we can call it, between Hong's movies. So if you watch a lot of Hong's movies, you will notice more and more there are recurring themes, right? So some people describe Hong Sangsoo as making the same movies over and over again. And his like plot is pretty similar too. So it's usually some guy traveling, a director or writer or painter or some sort of artist or professor. He travels and he meets new people and get like really obsessed with someone, and then get like humiliated, and then there's some sort of catastrophic failure. So there's like this person like struggling to get out of his own shell through this erotic relationship, but then there's like desperation, but also a lot of humor in it. And there are also like structure of films that make makes this repetition interesting. So some in Yourself and Yours, we see a lot of sort of repetitive structure in like Min Jung's dialogue with different men that are on the film, and Women on the Beach, there's like this movie director Jeong character's conversation with Moon-suk, the first woman that he encounters. That dialogue is really repeated again in between Jeong and Sun-hee, the second woman that he runs into. It gets repeated there, right? And Hill of Freedom, there I think the repetition is found in the conversations, the dialogues. So people ask this character, male character, Mori, do you like Koreans? What is your impression? Like, why are you here? Business or pleasure, right? So there's like cliches that are circulated in his movies. So there's a repetitive part. And some of his movies actually show a very similar story occurring twice in the movie. So the first part shows a series of events, and then the second part, perhaps from a different perspective, or with a bit of variations, you see the whole series of events again, but with, as I said, very subtle differences that really result in a very different set of affects, I think, right, or sensations. So so let's go to this quote in the diagram here under repetition. So this is Hong Sangsoo's diagram. So when the interviewer asked him, when you repeat the story twice in your movie, what is the relation between these two, right? Like, is one the original and the other is a copy or a variation, or is it a memory of that event, right? And this is what he says. Look at these two circles in the drawing as two independent worlds. If you believe there's a clear reason for these two worlds to exist, once you find the clear meaning between them, then these worlds themselves disappear. Once we make clear sense out of these two worlds, they are just used up. It happens that it is not easy to give them a clear meaning. So all the questions are kept alive if there's an infinite possibility of worlds. It's like a permanent reverberation. So for him, these two occurrences are not really mutually exclusive, but they can be composable worlds, right? Two different independent worlds. Perhaps it's one person's memory of this event and the other person's memory of this series of events can live together, right? And the fact that these are independent, the fact that there's no clear meaning or there's no clear relation that one is true and the other is false type of thing, that is actually something creative for Hong Sangsoo rather than something that's problematic, right? So in a way, the fact that we cannot approach this reality, right? We don't have this immediate access to the reality is something that makes life and the repetitions that we do more fun, right? And more creative. So I think I wanna perhaps like invite everyone to think about Minjeong character in Yourself and Yours in this regard. So is there one Minjeong, one like original Minjeong, and then there are other copies of Minjeong, right? Or is there even Minjeong character, right? This person, seemingly the same person, keeps denying that she is Minjeong, right? In this movie, Yourself and Yours. So perhaps Young-soo, if we see this diagram as Young-soo and Minjeong, there's infinite worlds possible, but then Young-soo is trying to fixate this Minjeong character into some image that he constructed, right? So he wants these two worlds to collapse, but then Minjeong sort of keeps refusing, right? That sort of collapse. Okay, so moving on, the people have been asking Hong Sangsoo that then, well, your movie seems too much like your own life, right? Especially recent movies that he made, people have been saying that this is very similar to your life and having a relationship, this another woman outside of his marriage and things like that. So there was a scandal around it. So there's a debate about Hong Sangsoo's movies and his own life, the relationship between them. And it's also a question we can ask, a philosophical question about art, right? Like how do we see the artist and their relationship with the artwork? Or their relationship, the work's relationship with the reality. So the third diagram here, this is also from Hong Sangsoo, interview with Hong Sangsoo. So in his words, Hong says, imagine this rectangle is real life. I try to come as close as possible to it. How? Using the details of my life, things I've lived, things I heard from other people I know or I just met. I always mix different sources and it's never about myself, but it looks like something that happened or looks like it's about me. I want it to be like that. I realized that when I was 23 and was writing a script based on a real story. It felt too intense. I couldn't move. I needed distance. In the same way, my films are never a parallel line to reality. What I intend to do is to follow an arrow towards reality, avoiding it at the very last second. So first of all, I think Hong Sangsoo believes that repetition always carries difference. So whenever these dialogues are repeated, it has a very different feeling and atmosphere, right? Because it's always in a different context. So I wonder if he thinks that repetition itself cannot be the repetition of the same, but it always is a repetition of differences. And he's also more interested in how to not repeat and get stuck with this like, right, predetermined meanings of things and free up some space. for spontaneity or some new meaning to arise, a space where some meaning, a new thing could arise. So let's see. So I think he touches on a lot of the things that make us repeat the same thing by showing these characters who repeat the same mistakes, but then really struggle to get out of it. So maybe we can list a few things like our disposition or our sedimented habits of perception, like perceptual schema that we are stuck with, preconceptions, prejudice, and fear. I think fear is important for Hong's movies as well. So this is why it's so important for him to invite these accidents, coincidences, and also spontaneity in his filmmaking process and also within his films. So some of the devices that really break the totality of this reel, right? Like, so there's an arrow that goes moves away from the reel at the last minute, right? He says so. He refuses to make his film a closed world where causation and in fact the consequences are relations are very clear. So he has some devices that he planted in there. First of all, the filmmaking process, coincidence is almost sacred in his movies, it seems like we heard from just director Jeong character in Woman on the Beach, right? His film scenario talks about miracle and how he can really find out the secret of the universe, right? The universal principle if he figures out why these coincidences occur, right? And these are some of the fun facts. For Yourself and Yours, Young-soo character appears one day all of a sudden with on crutches, right? But it wasn't the director's intention, but the actor actually got injured and showed up, right, showed up with crutches, so he just embraced that. And this central topic of temporality in Hill of Freedom, the book Mori was reading was entitled Time, right? But it wasn't a prop, but it was actually one of the books that this actor Kase-ryo brought with him, right? So these are really these really show the openness that Hong has, like in his attitude, right, when he films these movies. And within like cinematic devices, if we talk about, there are things that really shuffles up the order of things in the movie. For example, Hill of Freedom, what's important is the non-linear structure, right? The temporal order is really shuffled and reconstructed because the character Kwon drops the letters and then they get all mixed up, so they are not really dated, so we don't know in what order what happened. And one of the letters was missing, right? Like, so she didn't really know that one was missing, so there's no totality, right? It makes the structure open. And then of course Yourself and Yours, what is being questioned is self-identity, right? So the director seems to avoid this very reductive process of recognition of a person or an object that doesn't leave, that always leaves out all the differences that are not captured within that concept, right? So this like categorization or recognition process that always reduces the reality into some concepts. Let's see. So Hong always argues that he only makes fragments and there's no meaning behind why these elements are arranged in this way, right? So the meaning construction is really the role of the audience. So the audience is not simply a viewer, but they have to read, they have to be a very active reader. They have to put together different fragments together and construct their own meaning. And that also creates different sort of resonance and repetitions within them, right? So in that sense, like, I think these two ideas, repetition and the idea of reality that's sort of disjointed, these two ideas can be helpful to discuss a lot of Hong's movies. Okay, I'm gonna stop my screen share here, and then I'll hand it over to Adam.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Boram. That was really insightful, those quotes and diagrams. I'm not going to talk for very long. I just want to, I want to give you, I want to just say, get a few things out there, and none of this is very definitive. I think there's not much that one can say definitively about a filmmaker of this sort. A lot of people have compared his work to kind of the French New Wave directors, especially Eric Rohmer or Rohmer. And I was trying to think a little bit about how they're alike and how they might differ. And one of the ways that I thought, at least, and I should confess right off the bat that I haven't seen of the 27, did you say? Of the 27 films of his, I've only seen really a small fraction. So I can't really, I'm generalizing here on the basis of those that I've seen. But one of the differences is that when you watch a French New Wave film, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, even in Rohmer or Rohmer, there's a plot. And when you're watching a film with a plot, it's like, kind of like putting a puzzle together. You start with the pieces along the edges, and you work your way into the center. And as the plot resolves, oftentimes in the final scene, it's like you're placing that last piece of the puzzle, and there's something incredibly satisfying about that, even if the picture that presents itself then is different from what you had expected all along, which is typically the case. But when you're watching a Hong Sangsoo film, it's more like, 2/3 of the way through the puzzle, you realize that there are just not enough pieces left in the box to fill the big gaping hole in the center in, right? And so there's this kind of strange, deeply dissatisfying experience, at least that I have in watching his films, because you just know that there's no way you're going to be able to complete this puzzle. And then, you leave the puzzle out on the coffee table of your mind for a couple of days, and then a couple of days pass and you stumble over it again. And then strangely, what you realize is that the kind of contours of the missing gap paint a kind of silhouette, which isn't itself a resolution. It's not the image that the puzzle itself was kind of tending towards, but it's something like a substitute for that sense of completeness. So I think this you've been touching on this a lot in your remarks, this idea that in some sense his films are profoundly imperfect in the kind of scholastic sense of imperfection. They're missing something that ought to be there, but obviously deliberately so. They're defective in a certain way. There's something that you want, but you don't quite get it. And of course, what you're supposed to get is wanting it, I suppose, maybe something along those lines. And I was thinking about this in terms of the philosophical tradition. And of course, philosophy, at least according to some, has a kind of ambition for creating or producing some kind of comprehensive knowledge. I'm thinking of Wilfrid Sellers' statement that philosophy, expresses, the desire to say how things in the broadest sense of the term hang together in the broadest sense of the term. But that kind of comprehensive, all-encompassing understanding of reality, of course, is strictly speaking impossible. And this is something, of course, that my students who might be watching, who've read Kant, will know from reading Kant's Antinomies, that ultimately, even when it comes to knowledge of nature, reason runs up against itself. I mean, classic examples, watered down, as it were, a little bit. If you think about space, physicists today talk about the shape of space, or space, the universe expanding. And of course, when they talk about the universe, they mean both space and time expanding. But of course, so there's a limit to space itself. But then of course, every student sits down, scratches their head and think, wait a second, what is space expanding into? Obviously, space has to be a singular, infinite, total field, right? So reason runs up against itself. Space is either finite or it's infinite. Same thing with time. There's a beginning to time, let's say the Big Bang or something, but there's always the question, what happened before that? So when we're thinking about nature, reason runs up against itself. And especially when we're trying to think of the unconditioned nature in its totality, it's all the more true when we're talking about social reality, right? If nature is something which, as it were, defies any attempt to understand it in a comprehensive sense, say in a unified science, our social reality is one which, for which I would say it's perhaps not just impossible, but undesirable. And this is perhaps one of the things that Hong's films, I don't want to say teaches us, but suggests. I mean, just to give you one example, one that you've been talking about at great length, in Yourself and Yours, which, by the way, is in some weird sense, kind of like a classic comedy of remarriage, the sort of film that Stanley Cavell is so famous for having written a lot about, where a couple is having troubles and something drives them apart. Oftentimes these films begin with the couple already separated, and the entire thing is kind of getting them back together. And usually in those instances, what you discover is that the obstacles to their marriage, to their relationship, were not social obstacles. They're not external obstacles, like in kind of Romeo and Juliet, where the social opposition between these two families is what prevents the love from blooming or blossoming, but rather the conflict, the obstacles within the protagonists. So in some sense, Yourself and Yours is that kind of a picture, a remarriage picture. But notice how it works. Notice what the obstacle is. The obstacle is that the boy, and forgive me, but every Hong Sangsoo film, there's basically a boy and a girl, right? And then there's some tertiary boys and some tertiary girls. But anyway, so I'll just refer to these characters as boy and girl. The boy begins the film, he's happy with the girl until he discovers that he doesn't really know her, or he doesn't know something relatively trivial about her, namely whether she's been down at the bar drinking, right? So he wants to be able to come to terms with this. He wants to kind of know whether or not she was drinking, right? And the knowledge is an assertion of his power as well, right? He wants to know so that he can control her. And he's constantly talking about, how many drinks do you have? How many, don't have more than 5 drinks. By the way, I think it's kind of ironic that when somebody quits drinking, they have only 5 drinks. Anyway, so, but the point is, by the end of the film, the boy has completely relinquished his desire to know, or to at least have a kind of grasp of who she fundamentally is. Not only does she not recognize him, but now he can't be certain that this is a woman with whom he has no past, at least no shared past, right? And there's a point in the bar where the girl tells another man, you have to live with not knowing. And then she says something along the lines of, oh, it's mysterious and it can be fun. And I hate to make the lesson of the film so trite as that, but there's something to be said for this. I mean, by the end of the film, the boy basically comes to terms with the fact that he can't know her, he can't control her. So let's just eat the refreshing watermelon on the bed. I mean, I hate to say it, that's kind of, so what I'd like to say as at least one kind of quick attempt to kind of capture something about his pictures is that, in philosophy we have this classic problem, the problem of other minds. And Hong seems rather obsessed with this. What are my grounds for believing that Boram is another conscious being? She's just an image on a computer screen talking in ways that sound, whatever. So this question, how do we possibly access other people's consciousness to know that they're awake inside, that the lights are on? Well, Hong talks about in at least one of the interviews that I either watched or read, he talks about this problem in a way that somebody kind of on the street might talk about it. He says, how do I know that the ice cream that I'm eating now or that we're eating together tastes the same to me as it tastes to you? That's a question in philosophy we call a question about qualia. But the idea is something like, how do I know when I look at a painting that's red that you see the same red as I do? And intro to philosophy students get all excited about ideas like, oh, an inverted color spectrum. And if we had an inverted color spectrum where you see orange, I see blue, and where you see black, I see white, all of our words would still function. We'd still be able to get by, but internally we'd be having completely different experiences. This is, I think, the problem of other minds. In Hong's films, I think there's another problem, or at least the emphasis has to be placed differently. It's the problem of other selves. And so what his characters are constantly struggling to kind of occupy, as you put it, a shared reality, right? They want their selves to kind of manifest through their own actions, through their own words in this shared collective social space. And whether it be, ideology or social conventions or language, these are all, as it were, kind of structures that at least give us a grip on something that's shared. But that grip is never complete. It's never quite strong enough. And by the end of the film, we always slip off the rails. And that, to me, seems to be one of the brilliant things about Hong's films, almost all of them, is that you're constantly coming to terms with the inability to grasp the totality of the meaning of the film, but then also the kind of reality of a shared world within which selves can be mutually recognized. So I guess one last comment about that, and then we got to open it up, bring Keith back in for questions. So by the way, people, if you're out there listening, please start typing up your comments and questions. We'd love to hear from you. But on, let's see, Woman on the Beach, I think each of his films is kind of like an essay in the French sense of, essay, like to try out an idea on some specific theme. And of course, Hill of Freedom seems pretty obviously to deal with questions of time, yourself and yours, maybe unknowing or something, coming to terms with our inability to know others. And Woman on the Beach might have something to do with loneliness and recognition. I think the critical scene is when the woman is on the beach. I think it's at the apex of the kind of probably the most romantic moment. It's when the two lovers are still kind of not quite sure they feel the same way about each other. And the woman looks up at the stars and says something about how the universe would be lonely if we weren't around to look at it, right? To recognize it. And so the stars would be lonely independently of our recognition of them. And I can't help but thinking that when director Kim, the male character in the film, draws that first diagram that you showed us in your lecture, that he's really, in some sense, sketching out constellations, right? And so it's almost as if that scene ties together real nicely with the scene later, where there's this question about how, anybody's looked up at a night sky, without knowledge, profound knowledge of constellations, realizes that it's just a blur, right? There's so many different whatever, but somebody who's deeply familiar with, I guess, astrology or whatever the science of constellations would be, looks up and sees specific patterns. And so anyways, so I guess I'm just going to leave it there, because now at this point I'm just babbling. So Keith, why don't we invite you back in? Oh, actually, while Keith, you're coming in, let me just say, it wasn't until I saw that diagram in your presentation, Boram, that I noticed that, okay, the first triangle that he draws out, which represents, remember, I think it's something like the woman in bed with the lover and the lover's penis, is a phallus, right? It's very clearly a phallus. Right. But then you said something about the other configuration. You said that it's a coffin. Now that's brilliant right there, right? Because you have libido and Thanos, you have you have Eros, the kind of sex drive, and you have the death drive, and these two competing constellations that could kind of be used to kind of make sense of another and recognize another. Anyway, so, okay. Keith, any questions coming in? There he is.
Hey guys. All right. Actually, yes, we've got some questions. Also have some great comments. People saying, let's see, thank you so much, Dr. Jeong, Dr. Graves. This has been a great presentation. so interesting. So
Well, let's just leave it there. No, I'm
yeah,
kidding.
and that's it. No, but we do have some actual questions regarding everything tonight. All right, first one comes to us from Juliet Lee. I'm curious about the tension between Hong's interest in multiplicity and his use of single cameras and one-take shots.
Can you repeat that again?
Yeah, sure. I'm curious about the tension between Hong's interest in multiplicity and his use of single cameras and one-take shots.
Do you want to give it a shot?
Sure. So, for example, his movie Right Now, Wrong Then is the one that I mentioned earlier, that part one has, he doesn't call it part one, but the first half of the movie has actually a different title, right? I think it's Right Then, Wrong Now, the first part. And then the series of events happens, and then the second part has the title of the movie. So, and then this seemingly same series of events happen, but dialogues are slightly different, right? With a small but very significant variation, I would say. And the way he shot this film was that he shot the first part and then edited and showed it to the actors, and then they watched it and they acted again. So that's how he made this film. And in one of the interviews, he said the interviewer asked him, if this was an art installation, would you I guess play these two stories side by side, right? So it'll be actually simultaneous, right? Composable worlds. And his answer, Hong's answer, was that perhaps, but in any case, the viewer has to start watching one or the other first, right? So the way we see the world is already bound to this linearity of time, that that what comes first and what comes later in his movies really didn't have that significant meaning, was what he was saying. So I wonder if that's sort of related to this question, the linearity and the unity, and perhaps like singular versus a multiplicity that he's interested in, that he wants to grasp by sort of reconstructing it, right, around this linear time.
One thing I'd add there is that, I think it's pretty clear from everything I've read about Hong that the single camera shot with the long takes is almost exclusively a product of his process and the limitations that he likes to work with. He kind of, he probably could make a bigger budget film, but he doesn't do that, and so he's kind of limited with one camera crew, one camera, or one cinematographer, that is. But you have to admit that a picture that has the say, for example, a camera fixed on each of the actors' faces, right? So what's that camera shot called again? Keith would know. Multiple camera shots with lots of disjointed and strange angles and things, in some sense present the viewer with a kind of false sense that they're viewing things objectively. It's like The View from Nowhere. When the camera's seated at the table, right, with you, and the actors are the characters are just having a conversation, it's incredibly intimate, and you feel like you're witnessing the conversation as a human would, which is not a view from nowhere, but the view from who you are, from where you are. So I think that's actually that the sense that there's this kind of, that reality is disjointed and there's a kind of multiplicity of perspectives, is something that's better articulated by way of these long shots, single camera.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I like that.
All right, you guys ready for another question?
Sure, shoot.
Okay. This comes to us from Gabriel McGee. So, do you think that the love or mutual connection in these films is a sort of solution to this kind of problematic fact that time and people are duplicitous? Pun of duplicated intended. You want me to repeat that, or
maybe these are complicated, sophisticated questions. What an audience we've got here.
So do you think that the love or mutual connection in these films is a sort of solution to this kind of problematic fact that time and people are duplicitous? And they mean that pun of duplicated.
I have to think about if there's a solution, but I think there is actually a very spiritual aspect to his work. I think I notice it more and more as I watch it multiple times, as I watch his movies multiple times. Like, I guess Woman on the Beach, there's a scene, all of a sudden the director, Jung is bowing to the trees, like 3 trees, right? And he cries, like really genuinely, and help me please, right? And then similar scene is in another movie of his more recent movie, On the Beach and Night Alone, I think, where the character bows to the bridge, like wooden bridge, before she crosses. And so I mean, that's one thing. There is a spiritual hunger in the movie, and apparently there's like a prayer or sort of complaint, or however you call it, like asking for help. The character wants to get out of this human condition, right? But love, I think it is a recurring theme, and that's all that's happening, right, in his movies, the romantic relation or failed romantic relationship. The reason Hong explained why he always talks about romance is that it's where the cliches are needed most, right? So all the characters just all of a sudden shout and like, I love you. Like there was nothing happened. And then like, I don't know what the hell's going on. They're like, I love you, right? So there is that craving, right? The craving to reach to the other person's mind. So I don't know if that's a real love or it's really an expression of your desperate desire to connect. But in his movies, it seems like it's shown through this sort of humorous, but also very desperate moments of confession of love. So in that way, I guess Hong sees it as like that's at least one of the ways that we search for solution, right? For this isolation or solitude, right?
Yeah. Okay. All right, moving to the next question. This comes from, it's a follow-up from Gabriel McGee, the previous question. Sangsoo says in Yourself and Yours, the most important thing in life is love. Everything else is just compensation for when you don't have it. Is that true for Sangsoo?
I don't know if it's true for the director himself, right? But in his movies, it seems like that's where one person, like one can maybe get out of themselves most. Not easily, but in a very mundane context, I would say, right? Like it's part of our life, and see I think beauty is also important, that you recognize the beauty of the other, right? And you sort of let this that let these what was it, the wavy figure, right, in the diagram, let these ungraspable reality emerge through the other, right? Some of the moments where you are maybe off guard, you are not really thinking clearly, and then there's something like that's not recognizable, but something that sort of force you to get out of your shell happens, and that happens in a romantic relationship, right, in the movie.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, I have one question that I will answer, because this is regarding actually the release of these films. This comes from Milt Moyce. He said, as someone who's enjoyed a few of his movies I've seen, I remain frustrated by how difficult they are to find on mainstream streaming options. I'll just answer for you, Milt. Right now is a nice little moment. These 3 films that we have available on our virtual cinema are courtesy of 2 distributors, Grasshopper Films and Cinema Guild. And we're sort of put together, especially yourself and yours in Hill of Freedom. This is the first time they've been available in the US to watch in any kind of form, even a theatrical. They never showed in theaters in America until, well, they're not shown in theaters right now, but this release. And this was part of a Lincoln Center was doing a Hong Sangsoo tribute just last month. So some rights and everything aligned to sort of open the doors for these 3 films to come out first, and then more are to follow. So just know that in the coming months, you'll be able to see practically all of Hong Sang-soo's entire canon of films. And their new film, The Woman Who Ran, is hitting the film festival circuit this fall. So look for our Denver Film Festival in October, November to potentially have that film. I know we're definitely looking towards it, so just keep that in mind. But that's probably the only one that relates to me. Let's get back to a bigger discussion question. This comes to us, also from Julia Lee from earlier. Is Sangsoo's anti-cinematic approach to creating movies part of a broader aesthetic movement in South Korean film / video making? Or is his approach idiosyncratic relative, is his approach idiosyncratic relative to his peers?
That's not a question for me.
I think it's very unique in Korea as well. He realized that he wants to make a lot of movies and he doesn't want to make money off of it. And he wanted to, so he came up with this unique way of making a movie on low budget and in a very short time. And actors are not getting paid either anything or very little, even if they are very well established actors. So I would say it's very unique. And I've seen Hong saying it's the universe that made my films made my films possible, because it's all by coincidences and also with the help of people who are willing to participate in this project.
You know, I will say that there is a long-standing tradition that goes back at least to, I'm sure it goes back much further, but at least to Orson Welles' projects in the 1960s, when he was trying to develop what then became, I don't know, maybe known as like the film essay, and of course that pretty awful film, no offense, Orson, that's now I think still streaming on Netflix, called The Other Side of the Wind, which was his final project. But Orson early on said that, you know, directing a film is like presiding over accidents. And he thought that a lot of the accidents that occur, a lot of the unknowns, the unpredictable things that happen while the camera is rolling, are what make film magical. And so he then sought to kind of experiment with less formal modes of filmmaking, where actors are given just a few lines, if anything at all, or just a sense about what's supposed to happen in the scene, and then they go for it. And, you know, my sense is that that doesn't always work out that well. The problem is that you can't plan for accidents, right? It kind of saps the magic. But I think Hong has a certain way of making it work because well, first off, he does write a script. It's just that he writes the script the morning of. He, you know, sets his alarm for 4 a.m, wakes up, writes the script for the shot, the shooting that will take place just some, you know, a couple hours later. And so the actors aren't just given completely free reign. But my point, I guess, is what I'm trying to say is that outside of Korea, there's certainly obviously a kind of longstanding tradition of this kind of filmmaking. I think Hong is certainly unique, though. I don't know if anybody's quite as risky as he is. I mean, I don't know how he gets to bed at night on one of those evenings where he knows he's got his alarm set for 4 a.m. so he can write his script in the morning. I mean, how do you sleep under those conditions? I mean, anyway, so why don't I shut up now so we can get at least one more quick comment or question in?
Yeah.
Let's see. This is kind of a long one from Evan Morrison, so it's broken up a little bit, but I'll put it together. First of all, thank you both for the lecture and discussion. I'm curious about how Sangsoo depicts his method for showing the human condition in his films. As depicted earlier in the diagram with arrows, his work is not parallel to reality. As we know, parallel lines never cross and thus never intersect at reality. Yet his process never touches reality and stops right before, as if his films want you to collide with your own reality, but only enough to see collision so you come to grips with reality indirectly. What do you think this method serves that classic films on the human situation do not?
Oh, Evan, that's like a loaded question, right? Talk about, I think we would need to study the question before we get answered. I will say that I like what you've said about kind of connecting Boram's point about his film not really, you know, just kind of reflecting off of reality, and so there's not, you know, there's a longstanding, I suppose, tradition of thinking about, I don't know, thinking about reality as that which frustrates expectations, right? So, for example, within the scientific community, within the scientific process, if you have a reigning theory, a theory of, you know, general theory of relativity or a theory of evolution or something like that, and all of the evidence, the new data points that come in simply support that theory, well, that's great. That's wonderful for the theory and everything. But it's really when bits of evidence come in that kind of butt up against the theory, right? Where our expectations are frustrated and where our anticipations are actually misguided, that we know that we're actually coming to grips with the real stuff of existence. And I think maybe the fact that Hong's films almost always involve people, I think, not talking past one another, but slightly misunderstanding one another, and therefore, you know, bouncing off each other in that sense. That's when that's where deep human connection actually occurs. It's really at the moments where people kind of find themselves confused or perplexed by what's just been said, that we really kind of tap into the other self. I don't know. That's an attempt. I don't think I did justice to the profundity of the question.
I think I would like to go back to what you said about imperfection as well, and like defective, right? Like plot, perhaps like incomplete plot. So I guess moving away from reality at the end, like that arrow movement would, as I put it, as I said earlier, it makes it an open structure, and what it does is that you cannot piece everything together, right, as one coherent story. And what the effects of that, I think, is one of the effects is that people, Hong's movies are one of those where people remember it all very differently, even if we watch the same movie, because we have to do a lot of work to construct what's in it, and then it's our job to piece things together. So I think he's like Hong's analogy is oftentimes like a spear shape, And like if you go inside the sphere, and then there are lots of fragments, and some people would pick, I don't know, 5 of those fragments and make a story, and others, perhaps there's more resonance, so they would pick like 20 pieces together, and then they would make their own sphere, right? So so in that way, I think that's one of the fun things about Hong's movies. Like we remember, each person would remember differently, and each person would have a different reason why they enjoyed the movie or why they hated the movie.
I really like that. I want to say, I know we're almost out of time, but I want to say something in response to that about time, actually, in The Hill of Freedom, because, like you said, the picture itself is a kind of scattered, or each of the scenes are kind of, you know, a reading of a letter, and those letters are out of order, so you don't know the order of the scenes. So you see these disjointed scenes, and the I don't know, the task, I suppose, of the viewer in some sense is to reconstruct the order. And I mean, there's all kinds of fascinating things to be said about this in terms of, I don't know, for example, Kant's theory of time and things like that. I'm thinking of the analogies and the critique of pure reason. But just really quickly, one thing I noticed is that how you decide to order the scenes obviously is going to determine how the picture you know, what actually happens in the movie and how things wind up. In part, that's because Hong doesn't, like some filmmakers, when there's an apparition or an illusion or someone is daydreaming, sometimes there's a kind of parentheses around that,
Yeah.
through some fancy camera work or some haziness or something. In a Hong picture, it's never the case. The fantasies live right there alongside the actual characters. You know, what is it? The on the beach alone at night. The main character sitting on the beach, and then some random guy comes and picks her up and carries her away. And it's like, clearly that doesn't actually happen. It's kind of fantasy. But there are scenes in I think Yourself and Yours, where the woman returns and is walking down the alleyway, and then he turns back to his friend, and then they turn back, and then the woman's gone, not there. It was clearly in his imagination. Anyway, but because you can't tell which of the scenes might in fact be a kind of fantasy, you don't really know how the picture ends, because you're arranging them and piecing them together yourself, which I think is really kind of brilliant. I found it to be a very difficult movie to watch, to be honest. But it's like when you see the picture on the puzzle on the coffee table of your mind the day after, it's like, wow, really quite brilliant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in Hill of Freedom especially, there's the scene where Mori wakes up, right? And we don't know from when it was a dream, right? And he says, "Oh, what a strange dream." And because it's out of order, we don't know if that comes
if that's the
10,
immediate scene, right, before it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's really, it's like a choose your own adventure, except instead of flipping to page 7, you just rearrange the various scenes, and you have a different story.
Mm-hmm.
Did you guys want to do one last question?
Sure, if you guys have time for it, let's do it.
Yeah, this comes to us from Sila Askara. What would you say his approach to using symbols in his films is? And are there symbols? For instance, scenes with small water creeks or that dog named Dream.
Yeah, I think he does use those, like Mori also, like the name of male character in Hill of Freedom's name is Mori, which could mean in Japanese like forest, but also death, right? And the stream scene is where there's the voiceover, like Mori, like someone's like someone's calling Mori's name, but I think these work as symbols in his movies, but at the same time, his choice is actually not made intentionally. So apparently, the name Mori comes from his nephew's name, and I think the name of the dog is actually the name of the dog. Same for the dog that's in Woman on the Beach, right? So I think he is aware that it's going to have a lot of layers of meaning when he uses it in the movie, but he doesn't bring it as like in an artificial way or with any sort of intention or purpose is what's a bit different. And right, and yeah, and it might be more on the audience's mind. Like I thought about crutches, like Young-soo on crutches in Yourself and Yours, and Woman on the Beach. The director injures his leg, right? So I saw that as sort of a pattern, but then as I said, Young-soo was actually, the actor was actually injured, right? So it wasn't intended in any ways. So symbols are created sort of accidentally, but they are still very rich. They still remain rich and meaningful.
One might say then, I'm just piggybacking on what you've just said, Boram, that maybe Hong's films in some sense speaks to our need for symbols and our desire to find them in things. Because after all, if a symbol's functioning, I mean, there's different ways in which you can understand what symbols do, of course. But one way in which certain symbols, a basic symbol works is to provide a kind of common shared reference, right? This is the symbol for that. And if we both recognize it as such, then we belong to a social community where we can communicate with one another and we can kind of have that kind of mutual recognition, which Hong's films seem to indicate is so difficult and tries to kind of, I think, in some sense problematize. So anyways, that's one thought that I had. But
yeah, that's right. I think that's very true. And it gets really interesting if we think about how the film critics write about his movies. One of the things that perhaps was not clear to non-Korean speakers was that in Yourself and Yours, Min-jung is reading the book. The book Min-jung is reading is Kafka's Metamorphosis, right? But again, that was just the book, one of the books that was in at the coffee shop. It's not right that what he brought. But what I was gonna say is that yeah, like film critics, I read a review that was a very, I guess, social, reading Hong's movies in a social and political one. So like Hill of Freedom, this person believes that Hill of Freedom is a story of international relations, like Korea, Japan, and America, the fact that they're using English. And I didn't see that layer at all in the movie, but there is a very strong desire for us to generalize something or find some meaning behind directors' choices, right? Like who they want, which actor they wanted to work with, and what props that they're using, things like that. So in a way, Hong's like sort of mocking this right seriousness or the gravity of this discourse of like meaning, like everything has to have a meaning.
And I suppose any film worth talking about admits for the possibility of this kind of multiplicity of interpretations and kind of an undecidability in terms of what the thing is actually about, which is why everything I had to say today had to be qualified. You know, I have no idea what I'm talking about because I haven't figured out really any of his films. Well, I suppose we should leave it there. What do you think, Keith?
I think that's a perfect place.
Thank you all for listening and coming, watching the films, or at least one of them, and joining us this evening. I really appreciate it. We know that there's increasing amounts of online content out there, so the fact that you joined us means a lot to us. And please, if you haven't checked out the other the Hong films yet on the Denver film site, the C Film Center site, please do, because they're not going to be there for much longer. Is that right, Keith?
Yeah, probably about a week longer. And this lecture will join those films starting tomorrow. So if you want to come back to it after you watch another one of the films, it'll be there for you there on the page at denverfilm.org.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Keith, and everybody at Denver Film. And thank you so